From Roughing It by Mark Twain. We were 6 days going from St. Louis to St. Joe, a trip that was so dull and sleepy and eventless that it has left no more impression on my memory than if its duration had been 6 minutes instead of that many days. No record is left in my mind now concerning it, but a confused jumble of savage-looking snags, which we deliberately walked over with one wheel or the other, and of reefs which we buted, and then retired from and climbed over in some softer place, and of sandbars which we roosted on occasionally and rested, and then got out our crutches and sparred over. In fact, the boat might almost as well have gone to St. Joe by land, for she was walking most of the time anyhow, climbing over reefs and clambering over snags patiently and laboriously all day long. The captain said she was a bully boat, and all she wanted was more shear and a bigger wheel. I thought she wanted a pair of stilts, but I had the deep sagacity not to say so. Mr. George Bemis was dismally formidable. George Bemis was our fellow traveller. We had never seen him before. He wore in his belt an old original Allen revolver, such as irreverent people called a pepper-box. Simply drawing the trigger back, cocked and fired the pistol. As the trigger came back, the hammer would begin to rise and the barrel to turn over, and presently down would drop the hammer, and away would speed the ball. To aim along the turning barrel and hit the thing aimed at was a feat which was probably never done with an Allen in the world. But George's was a reliable weapon, nevertheless, because, as one of the stage drivers afterwards said, if she didn't get what she went after, she would fetch something else. And so she did. She went after a deuce of spades nailed against a tree once, and fetched a mule standing about 30 yards to the left of it. Bemis did not want the mule, but the owner came out with a double-barreled shotgun and persuaded him to buy it anyhow. Our coach was a great swinging and swaying stage, of the most sumptuous description, an imposing cradle on wheels. It was drawn by 6 handsome horses, and by the side of the driver sat the conductor, the legitimate captain of the craft, for it was his business to take charge and care of the mails, baggage, express matter, and passengers. We 3 were the only passengers this trip. We sat on the back seat inside. About all the rest of the coach was full of mail bags, for we had 3 days' delayed mails with us. Almost touching our knees, a perpendicular wall of mail matter rose up to the roof. There was a great pile of it strapped on top of the stage, and both the fore and hind boots were full. We had 2,700 pounds of it aboard, the driver said. A little for Brigham and Carson and Frisco, but the heft of it for the Injuns, which is powerful troublesome, thout they get plenty of truck to read. But as he just then got up a fearful convulsion of his countenance, which was suggestive of a wink being swallowed by an earthquake, we guessed that his remark was intended to be facetious, and to mean that we would unload the most of our mail matter somewhere on the plains and leave it to the Indians, or whosoever wanted it. We changed horses every 10 miles all day long, and fairly flew over the hard level road. We jumped out and stretched our legs every time the coach stopped, and so the night found us still vivacious and unfatigued. Another night of alternate tranquillity and turmoil. But morning came, by and by. It was another glad awakening to fresh breezes, vast expanses of level greensward, bright sunlight, and impressive solitude, utterly without visible human beings or human habitations, and an atmosphere of such amazing magnifying properties that trees that seemed close at hand were more than 3 miles away. We resumed undress uniform, climbed atop of the flying coach, dangled our legs over the side, shouted occasionally at our frantic mules, merely to see them lay their ears back and scamper faster, tied our hats on to keep our hair from blowing away, and levelled an outlook over the worldwide carpet about us for things new and strange to gaze at. Even at this day it thrills me through and through to think of the life, the gladness and the wild sense of freedom that used to make the blood dance in my veins on those fine overland mornings. The coyote is a long, slim, sick and sorry-looking skeleton, with a grey wolf-skin stretched over it, a tolerably bushy tail that forever sags down with a despairing expression of forsakenness and misery, a furtive and evil eye, and a long, sharp face, with slightly lifted lip and exposed teeth. He has a general slinking expression all over. The coyote is a living, breathing allegory of want. He is always hungry. He is always poor, out of luck and friendless. The meanest creatures despise him, and even the fleas would desert him for a velocipede. He is so spiritless and cowardly that even while his exposed teeth are pretending a threat, the rest of his face is apologizing for it, and he is so homely, so scrawny and ribby and coarse-haired and pitiful. When he sees you he lifts his lip, and lets a flash of his teeth out, and then turns a little out of the course he was pursuing, depresses his head a bit, and strikes a long, soft-footed trot through the sagebrush, glancing over his shoulder at you from time to time, till he is about out of easy pistol range, and then he stops and takes a deliberate survey of you. He will trot 50 yards and stop again, another 50 and stop again, and finally the grey of his gliding body blends with the grey of the sagebrush, and he disappears. All this is when you make no demonstration against him. But if you do, he develops a livelier interest in his journey, and instantly electrifies his heels and puts such a deal of real estate between himself and your weapon, that by the time you have raised the hammer you see that you need a mini rifle, and by the time you have got him in line you need a rifled cannon, and by the time you have drawn a bead, on him you see well enough that nothing but an unusually long-winded streak of lightning could reach him where he is now. But if you start a swift-footed dog after him, you will enjoy it ever so much, especially if it is a dog that has a good opinion of himself, and has been brought up to think he knows something about speed. The coyote will go swinging gently off on that deceitful trot of his, and every little while he will smile a fraudful smile over his shoulder that will fill that dog entirely full of encouragement and worldly ambition, and make him lay his head still lower to the ground, and stretch his neck further to the front, and pant more fiercely, and stick his tail out straighter behind, and move his furious legs with a yet wilder frenzy, and leave a broader and higher and denser cloud of desert sand smoking behind, and marking his long wake across the level plain. And all this time the dog is only a short 20 feet behind the coyote, and to save the soul of him he cannot understand why it is that he cannot get perceptibly closer, and he begins to get aggravated, and it makes him madder and madder to see how gently the coyote glides along and never pants or sweats or ceases to smile, and he grows still more and more incensed to see how shamefully he has been taken in by an entire stranger, and what an ignoble swindle that long, calm, soft-footed trot is. And next he notices that he is getting fagged, and that the coyote actually has to slacken speed a little to keep from running away from him. And then that town dog is mad in earnest, and he begins to strain and weep and swear, and paw the sand higher than ever, and reach for the coyote with concentrated and desperate energy. This spurt finds him 6 feet behind the gliding enemy, and 2 miles from his friends. And then, in the instant that a wild new hope is lighting up his face, the coyote turns and smiles blandly upon him once more, and with a something about it which seems to say, "Well, I shall have to tear myself away from you, bud, business is business, and it will not do for me to be fooling along this way all day." And forthwith there is a rushing sound, and the sudden splitting of a long crack through the atmosphere, and behold that dog is solitary and alone in the midst of a vast solitude. In a little while all interest was taken up in stretching our necks and watching for the pony rider, the fleet messenger who sped across the continent from St. Joe to Sacramento, carrying letters 1900 miles in 8 days. Think of that for perishable horse and human flesh and blood to do. The pony rider was usually a little bit of a man, brimful of spirit and endurance, no matter what time of the day or night his watch came on, and no matter whether it was winter or summer, raining, snowing, hailing or sleeting, or whether his beat was a level straight road or a crazy trail over mountain crags and precipices, or whether it led through peaceful regions that swarmed with hostile Indians, he must be always ready to leap into the saddle and be off like the wind. There was no idling time for a pony rider on duty. He rode 50 miles without stopping by daylight, moonlight, starlight, or through the blackness of darkness. Just as it happened, he rode a splendid horse that was born for a racer, and fed and lodged like a gentleman, kept him at his utmost speed for 10 miles, and then, as he came crashing up to the station where stood 2 men holding fast a fresh, impatient steed, the transfer of rider and mailbag was made in the twinkling of an eye, and away flew the eager pair, and were out of sight before the spectator could get hardly the ghost of a look. Both rider and horse went flying light. The rider's dress was thin and fitted close. He wore a roundabout and a skull cap, and tucked his pantaloons into his boot tops like a race rider. He carried no arms, he carried nothing that was not absolutely necessary, for even the postage on his literary freight was worth $5 a letter. He got but little frivolous correspondence to carry. His bag had business letters in it mostly. His horse was stripped of all unnecessary weight too. He wore a little wafer of a racing saddle and no visible blanket. He wore light shoes or none at all. The little flat mail pockets strapped under the rider's thighs would each hold about the bulk of a child's primer. They held many an important business chapter and newspaper letter, but these were written on paper as airy and thin as gold leaf nearly, and thus bulk and weight were economized. The stagecoach travelled about 100 to 125 miles a day, 24 hours, the pony rider about 250. There were about 80 pony riders in the saddle all the time, night and day, stretching in a long, scattering procession from Missouri to California, 40 flying eastward and 40 toward the west, and among them making 400 gallant horses earn a stirring livelihood and see a deal of scenery every single day in the year. We had had a consuming desire from the beginning to see a pony rider, but somehow or other all that passed us and all that met us managed to streak by in the night, and so we heard only a whiz and a hail, and the swift phantom of the desert was gone before we could get our heads out of the windows. But now we were expecting one along every moment and would see him in broad daylight. Presently the driver exclaims, "Here he comes!" Every neck is stretched further, and every eye strained wider. Away across the endless dead level of the prairie, a black speck appears against the sky, and it is plain that it moves. Well, I should think so. In a second or two it becomes a horse and rider, rising and falling, sweeping toward us nearer and nearer, growing more and more distinct, more and more sharply defined, nearer and still nearer. And the flutter of the hoofs comes faintly to the ear. Another instant a whoop and a hurrah from our upper deck, a wave of the rider's hand but no reply, and a man and horse burst past our excited faces and go winging away like a belated fragment of a storm. So sudden is it all, and so like a flash of unreal fancy, that but for the flake of white foam left quivering and perishing on a mail sack after the vision had flashed by and disappeared, we might have doubted whether we had seen any actual horse and man at all, maybe. We had now reached a hostile Indian country, and during the afternoon we passed Laparelle Station, and enjoyed great discomfort all the time we were in the neighborhood, being aware that many of the trees we dashed by at arm's length concealed a lurking Indian or two. During the preceding night an ambushed savage had sent a bullet through the pony rider's jacket, but he had ridden on, just the same, because pony riders were not allowed to stop and inquire into such things except when killed. As long as they had life enough in them, they had to stick to the horse and ride, even if the Indians had been waiting for them a week, and were entirely out of patience. About 2 hours and a half before we arrived at Laparelle Station, the keeper in charge of it had fired 4 times at an Indian, but he said with an injured air that the Indian had skipped around so's to spile everything, and ammunition's blamed scarce too. The most natural inference conveyed by his manner of speaking was that in skipping around, the Indian had taken an unfair advantage. We shut the blinds down very tightly that first night in the hostile Indian country and lay on our arms. We slept on them some, but most of the time we only lay on them. We did not talk much but kept quiet and listened. It was an inky black night and occasionally rainy. We were among woods and rocks, hills and gorges, so shut in fact, that when we peeped through a chink in a curtain we could discern nothing. The driver and conductor on top were still, too, or only spoke at long intervals, in low tones, as is the way of men in the midst of invisible dangers. We listened to raindrops pattering on the roof, and the grinding of the wheels through the muddy gravel, and the low wailing of the wind, and all the time we had that absurd sense upon us, inseparable from travel at night in a close-curtained vehicle, the sense of remaining perfectly still in one place, notwithstanding the jolting and swaying of the vehicle, the trampling of the horses, and the grinding of the wheels. We listened a long time, with intent faculties and bated breath. Every time one of us would relax and draw a long sigh of relief and start to say something, a comrade would be sure to utter a sudden hark, and instantly the experimenter was rigid and listening again. And now at last we were fairly in the renowned South Pass, and whirling gaily along, high above the common world. We were perched upon the extreme summit of the great range of the Rocky Mountains, toward which we had been climbing, patiently climbing, ceaselessly climbing, for days and nights together. And about us was gathered a convention of nature's kings that stood 10, 12, and even 13,000 feet high, grand old fellows who would have to stoop to see Mount Washington in the twilight. We were in such an airy elevation above the creeping populations of the earth, that now and then when the obstructing crags stood out of the way, it seemed that we could look around and abroad and contemplate the whole great globe, with its dissolving views of mountains, seas, and continents stretching away through the mystery of the summer haze. At the Green River Station we had breakfast, hot biscuits, fresh antelope steaks, and coffee, the only decent meal we tasted between the United States and Great Salt Lake City, and the only one we were ever really thankful for. Think of the monotonous execrableness of the 30 that went before it, to leave this one simple breakfast looming up in my memory like a shot tower after all these years have gone by. At 5 p.m. we reached Fort Bridger, 117 miles from the South Pass, and 1,025 miles from St. Joseph. 52 miles further on, near the head of Echo Canyon, we met 60 United States soldiers from Camp Floyd. The day before, they had fired upon 300 or 400 Indians, whom they supposed gathered together for no good purpose. In the fight that had ensued, 4 Indians were captured, and the main body chased 4 miles but nobody killed. This looked like business. We had a notion to get out and join the 60 soldiers, but upon reflecting that there were 400 of the Indians, we concluded to go on and join the Indians. Our stay in Salt Lake City amounted to only 2 days, and therefore we had no time to make the customary inquisition into the workings of polygamy and get up the usual statistics and deductions preparatory to calling the attention of the nation at large once more to the matter. I had the will to do it. With the gushing self-sufficiency of youth, I was feverish to plunge in headlong and achieve a great reform here, until I saw the Mormon women. Then I was touched. My heart was wiser than my head. It warmed toward these poor, ungainly, and pathetically homely creatures, and as I turned to hide the generous moisture in my eyes, I said, "No, the man that marries one of them has done an act of Christian charity which entitles him to the kindly applause of mankind, not harsh censure. And the man that marries 60 of them has done a deed of open-handed generosity, so sublime that the nations should stand uncovered in his presence and worship in silence." The poetry was all in the anticipation. There is none in the reality. Imagine a vast, waveless ocean stricken dead and turned to ashes. Imagine this solemn waste tufted with ash-dusted sage bushes. Imagine the lifeless silence and solitude that belong to such a place. Imagine a coach, creeping like a bug through the midst of this shoreless level, and sending up tumbled volumes of dust as if it were a bug that went by steam. Imagine this aching monotony of toiling and ploughing kept up hour after hour, and the shore still as far away as ever, apparently. Imagine team, driver, coach and passengers so deeply coated with ashes that they are all one colorless color. Imagine ash drifts roosting above mustaches and eyebrows like snow accumulations on boughs and bushes. This is the reality of it. The sun beats down with dead, blistering, relentless malignity. The perspiration is welling from every pore in man and beast, but scarcely a sign of it finds its way to the surface. It is absorbed before it gets there. There is not the faintest breath of air stirring. There is not a merciful shred of cloud in all the brilliant firmament. There is not a living creature visible in any direction whither one searches the blank level that stretches its monotonous miles on every hand. There is not a sound, not a sigh, not a whisper, not a buzz, or a whir of wings, or distant pipe of bird, not even a sob from the lost souls that doubtless people that dead air. By and by Carson City was pointed out to us. It nestled in the edge of a great plain, and was a sufficient number of miles away to look like an assemblage of mere white spots in the shadow of a grim range of mountains overlooking it, whose summits seemed lifted clear out of companionship and consciousness of earthly things. We arrived, disembarked, and the stage went on. It was a wooden town, its population 2,000 souls. The main street consisted of 4 or 5 blocks of little frame stores which were too high to sit down on, but not too high for various other purposes, in fact hardly high enough. They were packed close together, side by side, as if room was scarce in that mighty plain. The sidewalk was of boards that were more or less loose, and inclined to rattle when walked upon. In the middle of the town, opposite the stores, was the plaza, which is native to all towns beyond the Rocky Mountains, a large, unfenced, level vacancy with a liberty pole in it, and very useful as a place for public auctions, horse trades, and mass meetings, and likewise for teamsters to camp in. 2 other sides of the plaza were faced by stores, offices, and stables. The rest of Carson City was pretty scattering. We were introduced to several citizens at the stage office and on the way up to the governor, from the hotel, among others to a Mr. Harris who was on horseback. He began to say something but interrupted himself with the remark, "I'll have to get you to excuse me a minute. Yonder is the witness that swore I helped to rob the California coach, a piece of impertinent intermeddling, sir, for I am not even acquainted with the man." Then he rode over and began to rebuke the stranger with a 6-shooter, and the stranger began to explain with another. When the pistols were emptied, the stranger resumed his work, mending a whiplash, and Mr. Harris rode by with a polite nod, homeward bound, with a bullet through one of his lungs and several through his hips, and from them issued little rivulets of blood that coursed down the horse's sides and made the animal look quite picturesque. I never saw Harris shoot a man after that, but it recalled to mind that first day in Carson. 3 months of camp life on Lake Tahoe would restore an Egyptian mummy to his pristine vigor and give him an appetite like an alligator. I do not mean the oldest and driest mummies, of course, but the fresher ones. The air up there in the clouds is very pure and fine, bracing and delicious, and why shouldn't it be? It is the same the angels breathe. I think that hardly any amount of fatigue can be gathered together that a man cannot sleep off in one night on the sand by its side. Not under a roof, but under the sky. It seldom or never rains there in the summer time. I know a man who went there to die, but he made a failure of it. He was a skeleton when he came and could barely stand. He had no appetite and did nothing but read tracts and reflect on the future. 3 months later he was sleeping out of doors regularly, eating all he could hold 3 times a day, and chasing game over mountains 3,000 feet high for recreation. And he was a skeleton no longer, but weighed part of a ton. This is no fancy sketch, but the truth. His disease was consumption. I confidently commend his experience to other skeletons. As soon as we had eaten breakfast, we got in the boat and skirted along the lake shore about 3 miles and disembarked. We liked the appearance of the place, and so we claimed some 300 acres of it and stuck our notice on a tree. It was yellow pine timber land, a dense forest of trees 100 feet high and from 1 to 5 feet through at the butt. It was necessary to fence our property or we could not hold it. That is to say, it was necessary to cut down trees here and there and make them fall in such a way as to form a sort of enclosure, with pretty wide gaps in it. We cut down 3 trees apiece and found it such heartbreaking work that we decided to rest our case on those. If they held the property, well and good. If they didn't, let the property spill out through the gaps and go. It was no use to work ourselves to death merely to save a few acres of land. Next day we came back to build a house, for a house was also necessary in order to hold the property. We decided to build a substantial log house and excite the envy of the brigade boys. But by the time we had cut and trimmed the first log, it seemed unnecessary to be so elaborate, and so we concluded to build it of saplings. However, 2 saplings duly cut and trimmed compelled recognition of the fact that a still modester architecture would satisfy the law, and so we concluded to build a brush house. We devoted the next day to this work, but we did so much sitting around and discussing that by the middle of the afternoon we had achieved only a halfway sort of affair, which one of us had to watch while the other cut brush, lest if both turned our backs we might not be able to find it again. It had such a strong family resemblance to the surrounding vegetation. But we were satisfied with it. We slept in the sand close to the water's edge between 2 protecting boulders, which took care of the stormy night winds for us. We never took any paregoric to make us sleep. At the first break of dawn we were always up and running foot races to tone down excess of physical vigor and exuberance of spirits. That is, Johnny was, but I held his hat. While smoking the pipe of peace after breakfast we watched the sentinel peaks put on the glory of the sun, and followed the conquering light as it swept among the shadows, and set the captive crags and forests free. We watched the tinted pictures grow and brighten upon the water till every little detail of forest, precipice and pinnacle was wrought in and finished, and the miracle of the enchanter complete. Then to business. That is, drifting around in the boat. We were on the north shore. There the rocks on the bottom are sometimes grey, sometimes white. This gives the marvellous transparency of the water a fuller advantage than it has elsewhere on the lake. We usually pushed out 100 yards or so from the shore and then lay down on the thwarts in the sun, and let the boat drift by the hour whither it would. We seldom talked. It interrupted the Sabbath stillness, and marred the dreams the luxurious rest and indolence brought. So singularly clear was the water, that where it was only 20 or 30 feet deep, the bottom was so perfectly distinct that the boat seemed floating in air. Yes, where it was even 80 feet deep, every little pebble was distinct, every speckled trout, every hand's breadth of sand. Often, as we lay on our faces, a granite boulder as large as a village church would start out of the bottom apparently, and seem climbing up rapidly to the surface, till presently it threatened to touch our faces, and we could not resist the impulse to seize the oar and avert the danger. But the boat would float on and the boulder descend again, and then we could see that when we had been exactly above it, it must still have been 20 or 30 feet below the surface. Down through the transparency of these great depths, the water was not merely transparent, but dazzlingly, brilliantly so. All objects seen through it had a bright, strong vividness, not only of outline, but of every minute detail, which they would not have had when seen simply through the same depth of atmosphere. So empty and airy did all spaces seem below us, and so strong was the sense of floating high aloft in mid-nothingness, that we called these boat excursions balloon voyages. Sometimes, on lazy afternoons, we lolled on the sand in camp, and smoked pipes and read some old well-worn novels. At night, by the campfire, we played euchre and 7-up to strengthen the mind, and played them with cards so greasy and defaced that only a whole summer's acquaintance with them could enable the student to tell the ace of clubs from the jack of diamonds. We never slept in our house. It never occurred to us, for one thing, and besides it was built to hold the ground, and that was enough. We did not wish to strain it. The Good and Curry claim comprised 1,200 feet, and it all belonged originally to the two men whose name it bears. Mr. Curry owned 2/3 of it, and he said that he sold it out for $2,500 in cash, and an old plug horse that ate up his market value in hay and barley in 17 days by the watch, and he said that Good sold out for a pair of second-hand government blankets and a bottle of whiskey that killed 9 men in 3 hours, and that an unoffending stranger that smelt the cork was disabled for life. 4 years afterward the mine thus disposed of was worth in the San Francisco market $7,600,000 in gold coin. There was a grand time over Buck Fanshawe when he died. He was a representative citizen. He had killed his man, not in his own quarrel, it is true, but in defense of a stranger unfairly beset by numbers. He had kept a sumptuous saloon. He had been the proprietor of a dashing helpmeet whom he could have discarded without the formality of a divorce. He had a high position in the fire department and had been a very Warwick in politics. When he died there was great lamentation throughout the town, but especially in the vast bottom stratum of society. On the inquest it was shown that Buck Fanshawe, in the delirium of a wasting typhoid fever, had taken arsenic, shot himself through the body, cut his throat and jumped out of a 4-story window and broken his neck. And after due deliberation, the jury, sad and tearful, but with intelligence unblinded by its sorrow, brought in a verdict of death by the visitation of God. What could the world do without juries? Prodigious preparations were made for the funeral. All the vehicles in town were hired, all the saloons put in mourning, all the municipal and fire company flags hung at half-mast, and all the firemen ordered to muster in uniform and bring their machines duly draped in black. Now, let it be remarked in parenthesis, as all the people of the earth had representative adventures in the Silverland, and as each adventurer had brought the slang of his nation or of his locality with him, the combination made the slang of Nevada the richest and the most infinitely varied and copious that had ever existed anywhere in the world, perhaps, except in the mines of California in the early days. Slang was the language of Nevada. It was hard to preach a sermon without it and be understood. Such phrases as "you bet," "oh no, I reckon not," "no Irish need apply," and 100 others became so common as to fall from the lips of a speaker unconsciously, and very often when they did not touch the subject under discussion and consequently failed to mean anything. After Buck Fanshawe's inquest, a meeting of the short-haired brotherhood was held, for nothing could be done on the Pacific coast without a public meeting and an expression of sentiment. Regretful resolutions were passed, and various committees appointed. Among others, a committee of one was deputed to call on the minister, a fragile, gentle, spiritual new fledgling from an Eastern theological seminary, and as yet unacquainted with the ways of the mines. The committeeman, Scotty Briggs, made his visit, and in after days it was worth something to hear the minister tell about it. Scotty was a stalwart rough whose customary suit, when on weighty official business like committee work, was a fire helmet, flaming red flannel shirt, patent leather belt with spanner and revolver attached, coat hung over arm, and pants stuffed into boot tops. He formed something of a contrast to the pale theological student. It is fair to say of Scotty, however, in passing, that he had a warm heart and a strong love for his friends, and never entered into a quarrel when he could reasonably keep out of it. Indeed, it was commonly said that whenever one of Scotty's fights was investigated, it always turned out that it had originally been no affair of his, but out of native good-heartedness, he had dropped in of his own accord to help the man who was getting the worst of it. He and Buck Fanshawe were bosom friends for years, and had often taken adventurous potluck together. On one occasion, they had thrown off their coats and taken the weaker side in a fight among strangers, and after gaining a hard-earned victory, turned and found that the men they were helping had deserted early, and not only that, but had stolen their coats and made off with them. But to return to Scotty's visit to the minister. He was on a sorrowful mission now, and his face was the picture of woe. Being admitted to the presence, he sat down before the clergyman, placed his fire hat on an unfinished manuscript sermon under the minister's nose, took from it a red silk handkerchief, wiped his brow and heaved a sigh of dismal impressiveness, explanatory of his business. He choked and even shed tears, but with an effort he mastered his voice and said in lugubrious tones, "Are you the duck that runs the gospel mill next door? Am I the pardon me, I believe I do not understand." With another sigh and a half-sob, Scotty rejoined, "Why, you see, we are in a bit of trouble, and the boys thought maybe you would give us a lift if we tackle you. That is, if I've got the rights of it and you are the head clerk of the doxology works next door. I am the shepherd in charge of the flock whose fold is next door. The witch, the spiritual advisor of the little company of believers whose sanctuary adjoins these premises." Scotty scratched his head, reflected a moment and then said, "You rather hold over me, pard. I reckon I can't call that hand, auntie, and pass the buck." "How, I beg pardon, what did I understand you to say?" "Well, you've rather got the bulge on me. Or maybe we've both got the bulge somehow. You don't smoke me and I don't smoke you. You see, one of the boys has passed in his checks, and we want to give him a good send-off, and so the thing I'm on now is to roust out somebody to jerk a little chin music for us and waltz him through handsome." "My friend, I seem to grow more and more bewildered. Your observations are wholly incomprehensible to me. Cannot you simplify them in some way? At first I thought perhaps I understood you, but I grope now. Would it not expedite matters if you restricted yourself to categorical statements of facts, unencumbered with obstructive accumulations of metaphor and allegory?" Another pause and more reflection, then said Scotty, "I'll have to pass, I judge." "How? You've raised me out, pard. I still fail to catch your meaning." "Why, that last lead of yourn is too many for me, that's the idea. I can't neither trump nor follow suit." The clergyman sank back in his chair perplexed. Scotty leaned his head on his hand and gave himself up to thought. Presently his face came up, sorrowful but confident. "I've got it now so's you can savvy," he said. "What we want is a gospel sharp, see?" "A what?" "Gospel sharp parson." "Oh, why did you not say so before? I am a clergyman, a parson." "Now you talk, you see my blind and straddle it like a man. Put it there," extending a brawny paw, which closed over the minister's small hand, and gave it a shake indicative of fraternal sympathy and fervent gratification. "Now we're all right, pard, let's start fresh. Don't you mind my shuffling a little, because we're in a power of trouble. You see, one of the boys has gone up the flume." "Gone where?" "Up the flume, throwed up the sponge, you understand." "Thrown up the sponge?" "Yes, kicked the bucket." "Ah, has departed to that mysterious country from whose bourne no traveller returns." "Return, I reckon not. Why, pard, he's dead." "Yes, I understand." "Oh, you do? Well, I thought maybe you might be getting tangled some more. Yes, you see, he's dead again." "Again? Why, has he ever been dead before?" "Dead before? No, do you reckon a man has got as many lives as a cat? But you bet you, he's awful dead now, poor old boy, and I wish I'd never seen this day. I don't want no better friend than Buck Fanshawe. I knowed him by the back, and when I know a man and like him, I freeze to him, you hear me. Take him all round, pard, there never was a bullier man in the mines. No man ever knowed Buck Fanshawe to go back on a friend. But it's all up, you know, it's all up. It ain't no use. They've scooped him." "Scooped him?" "Yes, death has. Well, we've got to give him up. Yes, indeed, it's a kind of a hard world after all, ain't it? But pard, he was a rustler. You ought to see him get started once. He was a bully boy with a glass eye. Just spit in his face and give him room according to his strength, and it was just beautiful to see him peel and go in. He was the worst son of a thief that ever drawed breath. Pard, he was on it. He was on it bigger than an Injun." "On it, on what?" "On the shoot, on the shoulder. On the fight, you understand. He didn't give a continental for anybody. Beg your pardon, friend, for coming so near saying a cuss word, but you see I'm on an awful strain in this palaver on account of having to cramp down and draw everything so mild. But we've got to give him up. There ain't any getting around that, I don't reckon. Now if we can get you to help plant him. Preach the funeral discourse, assist at the obsequies." "Obsequies is good. Yes, that's it, that's our little game. We are going to get the thing up regardless, you know. He was always nifty himself. And so you bet you his funeral ain't going to be no slouch. solid silver door plate on his coffin, 6 plumes on the hearse and 1 nigger on the box in a biled shirt and a plug hat. How's that for high? And we'll take care of you, pard. We'll fix you all right. There'll be a carriage for you, and whatever you want you just scape out and we'll tend to it. We've got a shebang fixed up for you to stand behind in number 1's house, and don't you be afraid. Just go in and toot your horn if you don't sell a clam. Put Buck through as bully as you can, pard, for anybody that knowed him will tell you that he was one of the whitest men that was ever in the mines. You can't draw it too strong. He never could stand it to see things going wrong. He's done more to make this town quiet and peaceable than any man in it. I've seen him lick 4 greasers in 11 minutes myself. If a thing wanted regulating, he warn't a man to go browsing around for somebody to do it, but he would prance in and regulate it himself. He warn't a Catholic. Scacely, he was down on 'em. His word was no Irish need apply, but it didn't make no difference about that when it came down to what a man's rights was. And so, when some roughs jumped the Catholic boneyard and started in to stake out town lots in it, he went for 'em. And he cleaned 'em too. I was there, pard, and I seen it myself. That was very well indeed. At least the impulse was, whether the act was strictly defensible or not, had deceased any religious convictions. That is to say, did he feel a dependence upon, or acknowledge allegiance to a higher power? More reflection. I reckon you've stumped me again, pard. Could you say it over once more and say it slow? Well, to simplify it somewhat, was he, or rather had he ever been connected with any organization sequestered for secular concerns, and devoted to self-sacrifice in the interests of morality? All down but 9, set him up on the other alley, pard. What did I understand you to say? Why, you're most too many for me, you know. When you get in with your left I hunt grass every time. Every time you draw you fill, but I don't seem to have any luck. Let's have a new deal. How begin again? That's it. Very well, was he a good man and... There, I see that, don't put up another chip till I look at my hand. A good man, says you? Pard, it ain't no name for it. He was the best man that ever, pard, you would have doted on that man. He could lamb any galoot of his inches in America. It was him that put down the riot last election before it got a start, and everybody said he was the only man that could have done it. He waltzed in with a spanner in one hand and a trumpet in the other, and sent 14 men home on a shutter in less than 3 minutes. He had that riot all broke up and prevented nice before anybody ever got a chance to strike a blow. He was always for peace, and he would have peace. He could not stand disturbances. Pard, he was a great loss to this town. It would please the boys if you would chip in something like that and do him justice. Here once when the mix got to throwing stones through the Methodies, Sunday school windows, Buck Fanshawe, all of his own notion, shut up his saloon and took a couple of 6-shooters and mounted guard over the Sunday school. Says he no Irish need apply, and they didn't. He was the bulliest man in the mountains, pard. He could run faster, jump higher, hit harder and hold more Tanglefoot whiskey without spilling than any man in 17 counties. Put that in, pard, it'll please the boys more than anything you could say. And you can say, pard, that he never shook his mother. Never shook his mother. That's it, any of the boys will tell you so. Well, but why should he shake her? That's what I say, but some people does. Not people of any repute. Well, some that averages pretty so-so. In my opinion, the man that would offer personal violence to his own mother ought to. Cheese it, pard, you've banked your ball clean outside the string. What I was driven at was that he never throwed off on his mother, don't you see? No indeedy, he give her a house to live in, and town lots and plenty of money, and he looked after her and took care of her all the time, and when she was down with the smallpox I'm d if he didn't set up nights and nuss her himself. Beg your pardon for saying it, but it hopped out too quick for yours truly. You've treated me like a gentleman, pard, and I ain't the man to hurt your feelings intentional. I think you're white. I think you're a square man, pard. I like you, and I'll lick any man that don't. I'll lick him till he can't tell himself from a last year's corpse. Put it there, another fraternal handshake, and exit. The obsequies were all that the boys could desire. Such a marvel of funeral pomp had never been seen in Virginia. The plumed hearse, the dirge-breathing brass bands, the closed marts of business, the flags drooping at half-mast, the long, plodding procession of uniformed secret societies, military battalions and fire companies, draped engines, carriages of officials, and citizens in vehicles and on foot, attracted multitudes of spectators to the sidewalks, roofs, and windows, and for years afterward, the degree of grandeur attained by any civic display in Virginia was determined by comparison with Buck Fanshaw's funeral. Scotty Briggs, as a pallbearer and a mourner, occupied a prominent place at the funeral, and when the sermon was finished and the last sentence of the prayer for the dead man's soul ascended, he responded in a low voice but with feeling,